Another big issue, and a significant one, where an issue where we've had a significant impact, is the issue of gerrymandering, which may be a word that people aren't necessarily familiar with, but every 10 years, the Constitution allows the states to reapportion congressional districts. So if you live in a congressional district, you may be moved into another, depending on how the district maps are drawn. And of course, the political classes have a very keen interest in making sure that if you're a Democrat, you want as many Democrats in as many districts as you can get away with, and similarly for Republicans. And what's been Judicial Watch's role in trying to police this? What laws restrict the ability of the politicians to manipulate these maps? And I know that's kind of a big question, and it's one that still has some unanswered questions in terms of what the law will require in the future. But what's been our role there?
A big role. There used to be a federal law, and I believe it was repealed in the 20s sometime, requiring compact congressional districts.
So what do you mean by compact?
You know, you could just say visually compact, but there are mathematical measures, including the Polsby-Popper compactness measure.
So this is how much of an election nerd Bob is. Bob has a methodology of analyzing whether congressional districts are reasonable or not, using a mathematical formula that he and a former colleague came up with, and it's actually used in these various cases. So you get to cite your own mathematical formula in your own litigation.
And
that must be fun. It's a
it
little
is,
meta,
but
isn't it?
I realize that the lawyers never realize that I'm the popper.
So the Popper formula,
Yeah,
you're the Einstein of gerrymandering.
No, because we tried to take this formula, and your first question was, where's the law saying you can't do this? Well, there used to be a federal law that was repealed decades ago, century ago. And then there were a lot of arguments, and we made them, that the federal Constitution requires, if you're going to require equal population, the other side of that has to be compact, non-gerrymandered districts. The Supreme Court of the United States did not go for it.
So if you're
in
looking,
2016, this was our Maryland lawsuit.
So if you're looking at your typical state, let's say a flyover state, right? The square states, and they've got the counties. They're usually square. You're supposed to look at that. You're supposed to look at that state's map and say, okay, well, this district is that county. The next district is the other county. Well, we don't have, we've got not enough people in this county, so we're going to put two counties together. But generally speaking, a community is part of the district as opposed to what is happening too often where, let's say, you're in the state of Florida, and I'm not saying this happens in Florida.
It happens in Florida.
But where you have a district that begins in Miami and ends in Tallahassee. Now, I exaggerate, but obviously that doesn't seem normal or right. But the question is it illegal?
To the extent that it's illegal, if it's not under the federal Constitution, the argument has to be made under state constitutions or state law. And there you can get some traction and some results. We got a result in Maryland under the Maryland state constitution. Other persons have gotten results. The one in New York is now up for appeal, but they did get a result that it was an unconstitutional gerrymander.
Based on our win in Maryland, if I recall.
It referred to it, yes.
So what happened in Maryland was the Democrats who controlled the legislature, and I don't like to be partisan, but that's the reality, is they control the legislature, and they get to draw the map, and they drew a map. There were, I think, 2 majority Republican congressional districts when they began. At the end of the process, there'd be half of a one that was barely a Republican majority, and the other was completely a Democrat majority.
Yes, and I mean you have districts crossing over bridges.
Right.
I mean you had some ludicrous-looking districts. One was described as a broken wing by a federal judge, a broken-winged pterodactyl.
So you challenged that, or we challenged that on behalf of candidates and voters in state court. And we got it's Maryland, so we did not get a conservative judge by any means. But this judge was pretty sharp, and she saw right through this political
Yes,
game.
and that's a national trend. I think that these state judges, one of the things the Supreme Court did when it said there's no federal claim here, is it said, now, of course, there could be claims under state law. And so everyone rushed out to their state courts, and that's where the fight is now, and we're part of that fight. But
now, of course, that now the other side of that debate from some of our conservative friends is that, the legislatures have categorical rights, it would seem, under the Constitution to draw maps. And of course, politics are going to get involved, and of course, Democrats are going to try to rig it for Democrats, and Republicans do the same when they're in power. And if you don't like it, vote out the legislature for the next time the census emerges. What's your response to that?
Well, what the Supreme Court said about one person, one vote applies to that. And what it said is this is one of those situations where you can't vote the bums out because the bums can protect themselves. What gerrymandering does is it allows legislators to effectively elect other legislators. Or put a different way, it allows candidates to win elections without having to convince anyone to vote for them.
One might
what
say
they ought to be doing.
One might say it's election rigging in terms
Yes.
of
It's
guaranteeing a partisan result.
It is clearly cheating. You're
Yeah.
not convincing anyone to vote for you.
So what was troubling last Supreme Court term is that obviously there's this kind of state consensus building around that political manipulation based on partisan affiliations not appropriate. Having crazy maps that kind of have someone in New York City have the same congressman as someone in Buffalo.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court seems to suggest you could sort voters by race any way you want to get the politically correct result. Am I unfairly characterizing the Supreme Court's terrible decision in that regard?
You're simplifying it, but that's the essence of it. Listen, there was a decision in 1986 that read the Voting Rights Act to permit a remedy of a racially drawn district. And how far you can take that racial redrawing has been cabined, among other things, by a lawsuit I brought in New York in 1995. You have to cleave to traditional districting criteria. The district cannot be too non-compact, and one way to measure it is with the measures we use. But you still are permitted, and in certain circumstances under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, you are required to draw such a district. Now, that area of the law is troubled, but there was a recent Supreme Court decision that upheld in so many words what was decided in 1986.
And that was how close, that decision? Do you recall? Was that 5-4 or 6-3?
It was 5-4. I believe that Justice Roberts concurred with the liberal wing and Justice Kavanaugh. And it was Kavanaugh who suggested other ways in which there might be a challenge brought to that practice. I personally think that drawing districts on the basis of race is not a good idea any more than drawing it on the basis of any other characteristic of the population. Districts should be drawn as neutrally as possible and represent communities. How you make that happen is with one person, one vote, and compactness.
I mean, but just think, and who loses?
But who listens to me?
Well, and I think people should listen to you, and people of good faith should listen to you, because just think about it like this. So Black Americans tend to vote overwhelmingly Democrat, right? So there is a value in having them in districts where Democrats are likely to succeed. But you also want to have them spread out in a way so that more Democrats can benefit from their voting power. And if you're a Republican, they see Black Americans as Democrat voters, so they're happy to see them in other districts. And so they get, so their power is necessarily dissipated. It's not, if it was naturally in one jurisdiction or one district, they would be able to get a candidate more in tune with their values not just, quote, a Democrat, but a Democrat who was more in tune with black Americans. And if they were in numbers where they might otherwise be in a normal district, in a Republican district, you would have Republicans paying attention to their political values in a more direct way. So they're treating black Americans terribly and dissipating their power while pretending to be concerned about discrimination.
Yes, and this has been noticed now for years. It was discussed a lot by Abigail Thernstrom. I mean, the idea is that Republicans, who are now, I think on principle, should be opposed to racial districting, now favor it because it allows the lawful concentration of core Democratic voters in a way that frees up Republicans to run in their districts without as many worries. And I think it radicalizes, on a larger sense, radicalizes both parties and allows people to succeed who don't have to try to appeal to other voters who are residually left in their districts. I don't think it's a good idea for that reason. And the Democrats have noticed this too. One of the untold stories of the past several years is that when Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was struck down, which was another provision that in certain circumstances required racial districting, the lawsuits pressed to undo those racial districts that were drawn to favor black populations and to concentrate black voters. The lawsuits were brought by Democrats. And this is, if we had an honest news media, this would be a story that people would know more about.
Well, let me be blunt if I could be. There's segregation in America, and at the federal level, the Supreme Court has endorsed segregation of voters by race in congressional in congressional districting. Am I correct? That you can. It doesn't mean people are forced to move somewhere, but the voters are forced into districts based on race. And if that's not segregation, I don't know what is. And I reject it, and anyone who supports it should be called out for their racialism.
Well, I reject it as well, but when I came close to suggesting this to, for example, the Florida legislature, there were massive objections to this. And this is why something of a political settlement.
Because the Republicans wanted to, have
they wanted a gerrymander.
Yeah, they wanted black Americans in one district.
Yes.
And that was and then they'd have all the other districts for Republican-leaning voters.
And listen, I mean, can you blame the Republicans for doing that? Okay, if they don't create a black majority district, they might be called racist. They will be called racist. And it's all a game, None of it's sincere. All of it's disingenuous. And it is a stain on how we do politics. And one day we won't have it anymore.
So the way to end race discrimination is to end race discrimination.
Right.
Let's just stop it.
Well, let's hope that the Supreme Court justices who say such clever things abide by them.
That's true. So the Supreme Court justice who said that was Chief Justice Roberts, who in ending that Fisher case, or ending racial discrimination in college admissions, previously endorsed racial discrimination in voting cases, at least in congressional districting. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.